Centuries of Oppression, The Road to 1918. Chapter 11. The Suffragettes, the Working Class and the Big Snag. When Mrs. Pankhurst's suffragettes carried slogans reading "Votes for Women," which women did they mean? The leading figures in the suffragette movement were middle class. The majority of the foot soldiers were middle class too. Millicent Fawcett's more moderate suffragists, the NUWSS, also included substantial numbers of working class women. And there were a number of other women's suffrage organisations which were predominantly or exclusively working class. For example, the Lancashire and Cheshire Textile and Other Workers Representation Committee. In contrast, the Pankhurst's WSPU were interested only in acquiring the vote for respectable, i.e. middle-class women. Quoting again from Sean Lang in Parliamentary Reform, "The question of which women should get the vote and on what basis had an even more divisive effect on the already chronically divided women's suffrage movement. Millicent Fawcett's National Union of Woman Suffrage Societies comprised no fewer than 16 separate suffrage groups, though at least it succeeded in holding them together. Mrs. Pankhurst's Women's Social and Political Union went through 7 bitter splits in the first 10 years of its life. The role of Mrs. Fawcett's suffragists in mobilising working class support has been stressed. By contrast, the suffragette leadership, Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst and Emmeline and Frederick Pethick Lawrence, were at best indifferent to working class support and, by 1912, increasingly opposed to it, to the point of expelling the socialist sympathising Sylvia Pankhurst altogether. In 1907, the WSPU had changed its stated aim from "votes for women on the same terms as it may be granted to men" to "tax-paying women are entitled to the parliamentary vote," which convinced Labour and the Liberals, not to mention the NUWSS, that the WSPU was, to all intents and purposes, a stooge for the Conservative Party. A brief aside. The claim that Emmeline Pankhurst might be a Tory stooge is hardly contradicted by the fact that she later stood as a Tory candidate for Stepney in 1927. Given this historical background, it is a delicious irony that left-leaning feminists today have adopted the Pankhursts as their heroes, stooges of the Tories. However, perhaps it does make sense. Sean Lang notes that the Pankhursts became stridently anti-male, ruthlessly dropping even the most loyal of their male supporters from the WSPU, and claiming, as Christabel did in 1913 in The Great Scourge, that men were little more than the carriers of venereal disease. Christabel had published the material which later appeared in The Great Scourge in the WSPU magazine The Suffragette. Emmeline notes in her autobiography that "there is no question that a great deal of the animus directed against us during 1913 and 1914 by the government was due to sex bitterness stirred up by a series of articles written by Christabel." In a letter to C.P. Scott on the 29th of November 1909, Lloyd George confided that talking to Christabel Pankhurst was "like going to a lunatic asylum and talking to a man who thinks he is God." Fitting then that she later took to lecturing on the Second Coming. During the height of the suffragette protests, Christabel fled to Paris to avoid rearrest. In 1921, shortly after women had attained the vote in the UK, she moved to the USA. Christabel returned to the UK briefly in the 1930s, stayed long enough to be honoured as a dame, and then fled back to the USA at the outbreak of World War II. But back to the suffragettes. Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst's lack of concern for the enfranchisement of working class men was their undoing. Mrs. Pankhurst regarded the manhood suffrage issue as merely a ruse to push female enfranchisement off the agenda. Pankhurst was actually pursuing a rather modest target of the vote for women on the same grounds that it be granted to men or variants on that theme. This would have enfranchised only a relatively small number of women. Simply put, she was not too concerned about giving the vote to the working class of either sex. She imagined that this would only make the task harder to achieve. On this point, she was both right and wrong. The key factor which she and those other suffragists who campaigned only for votes for women did not understand was that the main barrier to female enfranchisement was the fact that men had not yet achieved universal suffrage. There was simply no party political route to passing a bill to give the vote to women without first having enfranchised working class men. They failed to appreciate that the only way through the political thicket to achieve votes for women was via votes for working class men too. This was the big snag, and it worked like this. Consider any attempt to give the vote to some women without extending the franchise to more men. Which women could possibly receive the vote? Well, at most only those women who matched the enfranchised men, that is, the upper half of society. Broadly, the multiple attempts to enfranchise some women prior to 1918 had all been constrained by this consideration and, in practice, tended to offer the vote to an even more restricted class of women, the most respectable women, you might say. But this meant, or was presumed to mean, predominantly women who would vote Conservative. By giving the vote to a few million new Tory voters, the Liberal and Labour parties would, to put it bluntly, be shafted in the elections. So the very parties which were sympathetic to votes for women, in principle, got cold feet when it came to the practice. And Asquith, who was Prime Minister throughout most of the suffragette period, was Liberal, as was most of his cabinet. The Conservatives were not, in general, ideologically in favour of women's suffrage, though it is noteworthy that quite a few individual Tories were supportive, including Arthur Balfour, who was Conservative Prime Minister between 1902 and 1905. However, there was a threat that the Conservatives might support limited suffrage for a few respectable women because of the electoral advantage it was presumed it would give them. The dominance of the Liberal government after 1905 would ensure this threat to their election chances would not materialise, despite a majority of their MPs supporting female enfranchisement in principle. Of course, this problem could have been overcome by also granting the vote to working class women. But this could obviously not be done unless working class men were also given the vote. For this reason, it was a party political impossibility to give the vote to women, any women at all, until the vote had first been extended to all working class men. In short, the only viable route to female enfranchisement lay through universal adult suffrage. The barrier to female enfranchisement was the class issue of enfranchisement of the working class, not primarily an issue of sex. The Conservatives would be largely opposed to universal suffrage for both electoral reasons and ideology. The Labour Party, which was growing in strength, was passionately in favour of universal manhood suffrage and later would come on board with the women's claims. The Liberal Party, however, was split, and particularly those who mattered, the Liberal cabinet. As Mrs. Pankhurst herself was to observe, it was far harder to drum up support for working class male suffrage than for tax-paying women's suffrage. Unfortunately, Emmeline Pankhurst would never see clearly that the former was the barrier to the latter. This was the big snag, but almost all players in the saga were very slow to grasp its nature, and to this day it remains little appreciated that what the female suffragists had to overcome was not a misogynistic male hegemony, but a male ruling class which was reticent about handing power to the working class. There is plenty of evidence to support this perspective. Sandra Stanley Holton, in her 1986 book Feminism and Democracy, writes of the situation circa 1906. Although in general the Liberal Party rank and file was sympathetic to the cause of women's enfranchisement, the party's leadership was seriously divided and contained a number of committed anti-suffragists, like the future Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith. Moreover, even among those within the party and the cabinet who supported the principle of sexual equality, there were many, like Lord George, who feared equal votes for women. This body of liberal opinion believed such a measure would, in the main, enfranchise the wealthier women and thus damage their party's interests, for the existing franchise was based on property qualifications. So what Emmeline Pankhurst was attempting to do was an impossibility. The only way forward was universal suffrage, that is, democracy. Emmeline should have listened to Sylvia. And crucially, this big snag to the adoption of female suffrage is why World War I was key to women acquiring the vote, because it was World War I which resulted in the vote being given to working class men, the essential precursor to the female vote. It was World War I which unsnagged the big snag. The true history of votes for women is therefore really the history of universal suffrage, which is the history of the working class struggle towards democracy.